Amen. All right, so I'm excited to take a major step in our Hebrew study tonight. We're going to look at verbs. Verbs are a little bit different animal, and we'll get more into that here momentarily. But tonight will be the last night I'm going to bring and go back over the alphabet. I realize this is not a grammar class, so I'm not here to teach you Hebrew or Greek per se, but to give you enough familiarity that you can use tools. I would hope that it also gives you enough information that you might desire someday to go further in your study, whether it be in the Greek or Hebrew or both. You'll find that there is, even though it's significant effort, the rewards are quite great. And there's certainly effort involved, but the rewards are quite great when you're able to use the tools. It's not that we need to be readers of the Hebrew or the Greek, proficient readers and such, but just to be able to be comfortable enough to recognize the areas of in the grammar. And tonight we're going to show you a few things that will show you why it's significant. But tonight will be the last night we're going to spend the time on the alphabet and the vowels and such. Hopefully you've gained enough familiarity with it. I go over it over and over, more so than I did the Greek, because the Greek has a degree of familiarity that you could probably adjust quicker. Hebrew is totally different. We read right from left, and of course, the completely different symbology. And so we want to go back over this. So let's go together and remind ourselves of the alphabet and some of the other basic components. So let's start at the beginning. Let's go together. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mim, Nun, Samik, Ayin, Pei, Sadeh, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, and Tav. And so there's the alphabet, and you should have a degree of comfortableness by now, I would hope. Maybe not have it memorized, but at least be able to say, okay, I have some familiarity with it, and be able to look back and not feel totally overwhelmed when you see it. And that's really the goal here, so that you're not overwhelmed when you come across it. And of course, there are several letters. There are 5 of them that have final forms. In other words, the last letter is the same letter. It's just going to look different. Generally speaking, it's going to sort of stand up straight or straighten itself out, other than the mem sort of squares up. And of course, with the Kaf, the Mim, the Nun, the Pei, and the Sadeh. And the only difference is it appears when it's in the final form, in the final letter of a word, it will appear differently. It's still the same letter, still pronounced the same, but it appears differently. I think, and I didn't study this, but I think it has to do with if you look at the scrolls, and when they wrote, there generally would be very little spacing, and words would be run together and without vowels or vowel pointings. If they didn't really have vowels, they had vowel pointing. That didn't come to the Masoretes and around the 500 BC or AD time, 200 plus AD time. But ultimately, I think the final forms of these help to differentiate some of the endings of the word. That's my belief, but I hadn't really researched that. Maybe somebody will be very studious and do that. And then, of course, we have the Bagat Kafat letters. That's just an acronym that helps us to remember which letters. We got the Bet, the Gimel, the Dalet, the Kaf, the Pei, and the Tav letters that have 2 different pronunciations. And when it has a dot in the middle, it's called a Dagesh Lene, and that is a hard sound. When it does not have that dot, it's a soft sound. And so these letters, the Bet, the Gimel, the Dalet, the Kaf, the Pei, and the Tav, will have the Dagesh Lene or may not. And it just has a different sound. Although some of them, the hard and soft sound is not that significant in at least not in my nuance. I mean, I can't read or hear music or notes, so I wouldn't know the difference if you used it or didn't use it for, like the Pei, for example. It's a PH sound versus a P sound. But you have to really listen carefully sometimes. Or the Gimel, the GH sound for August or ghost versus the G sound. But, that's pretty nuanced, at least for me anyway. And then you have the gutturals. I definitely want to make sure you understand and recognize the gutturals. This plays a significant role in the verbs. There are 4 gutturals. They're called gutturals because the back of your throat is used in the pronunciation of them, although 2 of them at least, the ayin and the aleph, have no pronunciation, at least not in more modern Hebrew, maybe in original ancient Hebrew, but did, I don't know. I think the aleph actually has a pronunciation even today, but it's so minor, it's considered not to have one. But the hey and the and sometimes the resh are pictured as gutturals, and when we get to the verbs, you'll see how significant it is. The other significance about the gutturals is they cannot take a dot in the middle, ever, under any circumstances. No dagesh lene, no dagesh forte. Never is a dot in the middle of a guttural. That's why you want to recognize these. And the reason is because when we look at the vowels, you have those vowels that we call changing vowels. You know, you go from long to short to even shorter or reduced. Well, those will adjust or change because that dot in the letter next to it can't be put in there. And so it compensates. You have a lengthening, for example. And so it's good to see, oh, that's why this looks different, because there's a guttural there. And but really, unless you're getting into the grammar, it's not going to make a big difference, but you want to at least be familiar with it. Here we have, of course, again, the dot in the consonant. This happens to be a Vagat Kafat letter. It could be any consonant. The dot here is represented as a dagesh forte. That's different from the late. The dagesh late is one that changes the Vagat Kafat letters to sound hard or soft, and the dagesh forte is one that doubles the consonant sound. So this would be 2 baits. And even though it won't show up in the spelling of the word, that dagesh forte indicates in your pronunciation. If you were to rewrite it, you'd write it with 2 baits. Just like in the word we have in the text here, hashamayim, you hear hashamayim, you hear the shim twice, because there is a dot, a dagesh forte in the shim. So again, there will be no dagesh forte in the gutturals. And then, of course, we have our vowels. These are called changing vowels. It's not that they change for the vowels themselves, but in their position, they will change depending upon what happens to the word. If it gets lengthened or shortened, or if something's added to it, if you have a dagesh. Oh, my wife's right on time. How about that? She didn't hear that. So has the if it had, so say use like when we had the article, we put the dagesh forte in the letter next to it. Well, if that letter happens to be a guttural, it can't go. So hence the potic underneath the letter underneath the hey will lengthen. All that to say, we'll see that in a moment. So these vowels will change in that you can go from long to short to even shorter. The sounds are generally the same. The kamates is the ah sound, the padak is an ah, and the reduced or the short hatep padak is ah. It's just shorter. It's the same sound. Even with the setere and the segol and the hatep segol, although I've been in the habit of using the setere to make more of an a sound, but it's probably more of an e sound, be versus the segol be versus the hatep segol be. So it's really more of that E sound, although I learned it, and it's probably not wrong. I just, it's one of those things we don't really know how to pronounce originally, but anyway, it's probably more correct to make it more the E sound. The Herrick is just an I sound like in bitter, and there's no long or short relative to that. And the O vowel, you can have the holum, which is the long, it's the O, so it'd be bo. And the kamate tatu looks like a kamate. There are certain clues that will tell you whether it's a kamate tatu. There are very few of those compared to the kamates, but there are certain clues that we just really won't get into in this class that tell you that, again, it's a short O. So instead of like the holum bo, this would be more like bo. So it's just a shorter tongue. And the hatef kamates again, is both. It's just shorter. Sometimes it's hard to differentiate between those. And then you have the U vowel, and it's a short in the kibitz, so that'd be boo, like in Halloween, boo. And then you have, of course, what they refer to as the letter vowels, that is with the hey and with the vav and the yod. And these letter vowels do not change. They don't reduce. They're fixed. And so you can have the exact same sounds. The kamate's hey is still ba, just like the changeable vowel with the kamate's ba. It's the exact same sound. It's just it won't change. So it uses the consonant, the hey, with the kamate's vowel, but that consonant is no longer consonant when it's used in this fashion. It is a vowel. So you don't pronounce that hey, you pronounce the vowel, ba. Not ba, as in ba ba black sheep, but ba. And so you have the segol hey would be be, and then the sere hey would be be. And the holum hey would be bo. You have the holum vav, which would be also bo. And then the shuruk, which here's a U class vowel, this would be boo. And of course, the yod is the segol yod, the sere yod, and the hirik yod. So the be, and b, or be. So some variation with that, probably depending on what accent you use or how you pronounce things. But generally speaking, the Shabbat is very important to recognize. It's those two vertical dots. And it's called a Shabbat. It does not belong to the vowel class, but it functions similar to a vowel in terms of sound. It has a very short E, so this would be like be. There's a silent Shabbat and a vocal Shabbat. If it's in the beginning of a word, it's a vocal. It would be be. If it's so you get into open and closed syllables. If it's the closed syllable, or if it's with another Shabbat, then it might be silent, and you just have the consonant sound without the S sound to it. That I'm not worried about the pronunciation as much as just recognizing that Shabbat is what I'm trying to get to. And we spent some time looking at roots. Very important. We looked at roots, and at least for me, it makes things sort of come to give it some structure. We did that in the Greek and in the Hebrew as well. Hebrew, to me, one of the reasons Hebrew is easier is because of the root system. Typically, there are the vast majority of triconsonantal roots are three consonants that function as the root. There are also biconsonantal, that means two, although some of those two actually have a third, but it's hidden. It's fell away, let's say. But there's also what's called quadconsonantal, is that right? It's 4 root words. But most are 3 root words, and so that's what we're focusing on. And you can add, just like we did in the Greek, you could put prefixes to it, and suffixes to it, and inflexes to it. And with any of those, it changes how the vowels are used. Basically, typically, not in all cases, but typically the pronunciation is going to be accent at the end of the word. And so in doing so, is that me or somebody? I heard it ding. It wasn't me. Okay. So in doing so, that will change and typically shorten the vowels that are used at the beginning of the word. That will change. And so oftentimes you'll see the Shabbat at the beginning because that's a very short vowel sound, be, or in this case would be de. Vowel patterns that are underneath actually are really significant to recognize, and they help especially in verbs, and we'll touch on that tonight. Tonight when we get to verbs, all we're going to do is give an overview. Just a quick overview, and then we'll spend the next 4 weeks looking at some of the verbs and specifics. But just to finish our summary on nouns, and so we have both gender and number in our nouns. We have number being singular, plural, or dual, and gender, of course, would be masculine or feminine. And these, again, are grammatical categories. They are not necessarily or not specifically male or female, but they're grammatical categories. They become important in terms of how words can align with other words. They're in agreement. A masculine word would be in agreement with another masculine word. these kind of things for adjectival purposes. So here we have the horse, sus. That's the summec with the shuric, and the summec, so that's sus. And to make it plural, we add this hieric yod and final mem. And typically, when you see a word that has the hieric yod and the final mem, that means it's plural. This happens to be a masculine word, and or being used masculine, because you can also have female horses. Being used masculine, and so it's using the masculine form will typically use this hieric yod and final mem. It's a very quick, easy clue. So this is susim, and so that's horses. Now, if there are two horses, then we add the diphthong. And the diphthong, just like in Greek, the two vowels that are pronounced as one. And so you have this little caret on top, which typically where the accent shows. And you have underneath it the potic, and then you have a yod with underneath it a hieric, and then the final mem, that's a diphthong. And so that would be pronounced, just the diphthong would be I'm. And so this is susaim, two horses. And so when you see that diphthong, often, I can't say all the time, often you're talking about dual. Now, feminine words have a little different look. They typically end with a kametz he. Kametz he is very, very weak and will often change to maybe a tav or some other thing, but oftentimes a female word will end with a kametz he. And so here you have the law. The law happens to be feminine in its classification, and so is Torah. And then to make it plural, instead of using kametz he, you use the holem vav with the tav. So this is Torot, and it's a th sound at the end because it's not the hard pronunciation; it's the soft pronunciation. So it's Torot. And then the two laws, again, you have the diphthong at the end. The only difference is now they've added a kametz before it. They just have, I think I'm not an expert. I think it has more to do with the flow of the pronunciation. And so this would be Torah, Torate, right? Excuse me, Toratime. Toratime, yeah. Toratime, T-H-I-M. Toratime. So two laws. Any questions so far? Okay. And so we have also, we talked about a prefix that often used, more than any other word, is this vav conjunction. I think 5,000, 50,000 times, I forget now. We had it on one of the earlier slides, but more than anything else. And it's a vav consonant with the shabbat underneath it. And so when that is typically in front of a word, would be and or so or then. Context helps you determine which one. Excuse me. Oh, somebody from Hawkinsville, or excuse me, Eastman, passed Sister Luster. She was 101 or 102, we're not sure. So, sorry about that. And so this vav conjunction, basically added to the word is a prefix that's letting you know it's and or so or then. And so you have va'evid, this is and a bondservant. You have va'isha, that is and a woman. Isha is a woman. And you get va'ha'isha, that is and the woman. We'll do the article in a moment. And then you have va'ish, that ish is the man, so that's and a man. Then you have va'ha'ish, that is and the man, and we'll do the article next. And so you see the conjunction adds to the word and adds meaning to it. So the article is pretty straightforward. Basically, you're adding the hey with a potic underneath it and a dogish forte in the consonant next to it, whatever that consonant might be. So melech, to make it a king, to make it the king, you'd add the hey with the potic underneath it with the the Dagesh forte in the mem under Melech. And so you get ha-Melech, and it'd be the king. Now, that ha with the Dagesh, with the product underneath, there are different forms of this. This may change, but generally it pretty much stands out depending upon whether, again, there's a guttural next to it and the Dagesh forte doesn't go, or some other things may occur. And so it could be ha with a kamades, or ha with it. Sometimes it will take the vowel next to it. But generally speaking, it's still pretty recognizable. You don't need to be an expert, but to recognize, oh, that must be, if you can find the root, like Melech. I mean, Melech is always mem, lamek, ka. And find the root, everything else is just added to it. It doesn't really matter. Now, the vowels will give you some indication of what has occurred, as well as the letters that are added to it or on it. So, the definite article, for example, here we have again, on the house, you have bite, that is the diphthong, and you have ha-bite, the house. A road is derek, is a road, ha-derek is the road. A warrior is gibor, and the warrior would be ha-gibor. And so you can see we just added the prefix to it. Now, if you were to add the vav to it and make it and the house, that might change the vowel under the hey some. And sometimes if you add a sava, then that will, or if you add a preposition, then they'll two kind of absorb to each other. But there are changes that occur that are recognizable, and you'll know that it's a preposition with an article, even though the hey is not there. But generally speaking, you just notice that. To make a declarative statement, a question, they add at the very beginning of the sentence a hey with a reduced parak on it. And so the king sent the prophet, and you add the hey with the reduced parak under it, it becomes did the king send the prophet? And so it becomes, once you sort of get comfortable, you start seeing these things, you're like, oh, that's a question. Remember, in Greek, they use a grammatical marker. They use what we call a semicolon, and that would be a question mark. Of course, we use a question mark. Well, here they use a prefix to the first word on the sentence that would tell you it's an interrogative sentence. We also talked about prepositions. We didn't do all prepositions. There are dependent prepositions. In other words, they're stand-alone. We didn't even go over those. But I wanted to focus on the inseparable prepositions, predominantly these three, which occur most often, le, bet, and ke. These let mean to or toward or for, bet as in, at, with, by, or against, and ke as like, as, or according to. And these are added to a prefix to a word. And of course, once you add something to a word, it could change the vowel structure for it. And for example, well, I don't have it. I think I took the examples out. But we can see, for example, we talked about nouns. Nouns are either an absolute state, absolute form, or a construct state, construct form. If it's in the absolute state, that's what it's telling you is two things. One, it's either functioning as the subject of the sentence, or it's functioning as the direct object. Now, generally speaking, I can't say always, but generally speaking, if it's functioning as the direct object, it will add a particle that's not pronounced, it's pronounceable, but it's not translatable, and that is the et. And I don't think I have it here. Well, I might see it later on. And that would come and before the word, and that would tell you that word next to it is the direct object. If it's the absolute state, then it's going to probably possibly function as the subject. For example, we have sus for king, for horse, and melech for king, and we have devar for, I'm using word, and even with king, there are other translations for these, but the general predominant one. Yelid is a child or a boy. Yom is a day. Queen is, okay, my eyes are watering home a minute. Is Makha, And then law. If we were doing the grammar class, I'd be making you pronounce these. Okay, we would take, but unless you spend time with it, it would you might struggle with it, and it would take too much time. Torah, a wall is tomah, a daughter is bat, and a bow, like a crossbow or a rainbow, is keshet. So an absolute state or an absolute noun versus construct noun. Remember, in Greek, you would have different case endings on words to tell you how that word functions in a sentence. You would have the nominative, or the to tell you it's functioning as a subject. You'd have the genitive to tell you it's a possessive, or many other forms, but possessive is the general form. And you'd have the dative to indirect object and the accusative for the direct object. In Hebrew, they don't have those case endings. Instead, you have the absolute state or the form of the noun, and you have the construct state or form of the noun. It's generally pretty easy to recognize because there'll be two nouns or more nouns that will be side by side. And basically what it means is they're functioning in a genitive function or a possessive function. For example, here we have Eved Hamelech, Eved Hamelech. Well, the Hamelech has the article to it as the king. Eved is the servant. It does not have the article, but the article, when it shows up on the absolute noun in the construct chain, it's called a chain. In the construct chain, that article applies to everything in the chain. That's why it's the servant of the king. Not a servant of the king, but it's the servant of the king. Because I'm going to point for the guys here in the room, but I'm pointing to Hamelech. That article, Ha, this is the construct change, chain, C-H-I-N. Eved Hamelech, that's the chain. If it went longer, if you had more words altogether, this would be a longer chain. And the very last one might have the article. If it did, that article applies to all the words in the chain. It's not physically there, but it applies. So in this case, it happens to be the slave of the king, or the servant of the king. Eved is actually slave. It's a pet peeve of mine. There's a difference between servant and slave. But I understand why we do that. So let's see, what does the text say? The first two nouns of the construct chain is called the construct noun. It's used in the construct state. Second noun is the absolute noun instead of being the absolute state. The absolute form is the singular noun in its lexical form. In other words, and this is important because when you go look it up in a lexicon, it's going to be in the absolute state. It won't be in the construct state. Now, the reason I say this, and when you look at Eved, that looks the same as it does when it's in its absolute state, okay? But many words, when it goes in the construct state, the construct form, will actually change its spelling. And it doesn't look, it doesn't look the same. What is this? Once you figure out, oh, okay, I got it. You can't look it up with that word. You have to look its absolute state up. It's a lexical form. It's a dictionary form. That's all, okay? And so we have construct state, for example, in Kol Haish, the voice of the man. Again, you see there's only the article with the absolute noun. The Ish is the man, and so Haish is the man. But because the absolute noun has the article, and that article applies to the entire chain. So it's the voice of the man. Melech Ha-Eretz is the king of the land. Eved Ha-Melech is the servant or the slave of the king. Davar Ha-Navi is the word of the prophet. And then you have Sefer is HaTorah. Sefer HaTorah is the book of the law. So you kind of get an idea, see how that works? Okay, good. And you can have the construct chain, can have multiple words in it. In this case, we're showing here what's called the definitive construct chain. That is, it has the article with the absolute noun. We've already talked about that, the book of the prophet, Sefer HaNavi. And so it's the book of the prophet. But if there was not an article in the absolute noun, Navi, then it's an indefinite In other words, it's a book of a prophet. Okay, so because the article's not there, it's indefinite. That's all it's trying to do now. And so now we're going to get and move to Hebrew verbs. Now, here's the fascinating thing about Hebrew verbs. A lot of this may look overwhelming, but look what you already know. You're already familiar with roots. That doesn't change. You're already familiar a little bit with stems, but stems are going to be, when we did Greek, we would have the root and you add something to it to become the stem. In most cases, in the Hebrew, you add the vowels or the pointing system. That makes the stem. And then you're going to have what's called conjunctions, conjugation, excuse me. Not a congregation or not a conjunction, but a conjugation. I always mess this up. It is conjugation. In other words, you're conjugating the verb. And this is where you have multiple, well, I'm going to show you that in a minute, okay? But first thing I'm going to do is a quick overview on with this video. It's a cute little video. It kind of describes, there are 7 main verbs that we're going to talk about. We're only going to focus on 5 of those, by the way, but I'm going to give you the big picture of all 7. But we're only going to focus on 5 of them. And I like the way this video describes it. The typical way to describe verbs is basically the picture of a tree with the root and the stem, and then all the leaves become the conjugation. So they're going to start with that, and they're going to show you a different way to perceive it. And I kind of like that, so I wanted to show that. The guys online won't be, or in the classroom won't be able to hear this unless I put the mic onto the computer. But hopefully it doesn't give feedback to the guys online. So let's get started and see how this works.
Shalom, welcome to Blackboard Hebrew. I'm Tim McNinch and I'm so excited to share this video with you. It was a lot of fun to make. Hebrew verbs can be really confusing for beginners, and the concept of binyanim is one of those hurdles that lots of learners encounter. So let's jump right in. Bo natchil. Here's a good Hebrew verb, tizkeruni. Like most verbs, its core meaning is embedded in its 3-letter root, in this case, zayin kaf resh. This root, or in Hebrew, shoresh, carries the basic meaning of remember in all of its various expressions. Those specific expressions, like our verb tizkeruni here, are known as inflected forms of the root, or in Hebrew, the hatayah. Those extra letters nuance the meaning of the shoresh, with things like tense and gender and who's doing the action and to whom. For tizkeruni, we can parse the hatayah to learn that this is a kal imperfect second masculine plural verb with a first common objective suffix. Now that's a lot of technical mumbo jumbo, but the output of it all is that in this form, the root remember is inflected to mean you all will remember me. Now, among all that data, the part I want to focus on for this video is just this first element, identifying the verbs binyan. Especially for English speakers, this is the part of Hebrew verb formation that's the most unfamiliar, and so it can be a bit confusing at first. So there's a couple of metaphors that can help us make better sense of it. The first makes use of the plant imagery in the word shoresh. In forming verbs, you can think of the shoresh like the actual root of a plant. And the binyan is like the stem or trunk of the plant with the various elements of the hatayah, gender, number, person, etc., as the blossoming foliage. This metaphor is used a lot, and in English, you'll often hear the binyan referred to as the stem of the verb. But I want to really dig into a different metaphor, one that I think helps us get an even better sense of what binyanim actually do for the verb. It's an architectural metaphor based on the fact that the word binyan means construction or building in Hebrew. The word binyan was chosen by grammarians because it simply describes the various ways that verb meanings can build on the root. But I want to take that simple idea of building and use it as a metaphor. Instead of thinking of a verb's shoresh as a plant, let's bring it to life as a character. Say hi, shoresh. Shalom. Now, let's imagine that our shoresh lives in a city. In Shoresh's city, there are all kinds of different buildings, binyanim. And just like we do in our cities, Shoresh enters different binyanim for different purposes and has different behaviors in each one. So I want to introduce you to the most common of these binyanim, starting with Pa'al. The most basic of the binyanim is called Pa'al. The names of the various binyanim are all related to the shoresh of the word po'al, the Hebrew word for verb, spelled with the letters Pei, Ayin, Lamed. The vowel pattern for each binyan varies to represent how verbs in each binyan are pronounced in the third masculine singular perfect form. So in pa'al, that vowel pattern is pa'al. Like Shoresh's home sweet home here, the binyan pa'al is simple, unadorned. In fact, it often goes by the nickname kal, meaning simple or lightweight. This binyan usually gives the simplest sense of a root's meaning. For example, in the pa'al form, the root kaf tav bet is katav, he wrote. And the pa'al form of he lamed kaf is halach, he walked. Simple. But roots don't spend all their time at home. After breakfast and some delightful morning reading, Shoresh heads out for the day. Leaving the binyan pa'al behind, Shoresh heads for the gym for a morning workout. In the PL gym, Shoresh does a high-intensity workout with lots of reps. That's because verbs in PL form are more intense than their Pa'al counterparts, or their repeated actions. The vowel pattern in PL is a hirik after the first consonant, and a dagesh chazak in the middle root consonant. This is where it's a bit unfortunate that the Hebrew names of the binyanim use the shoresh Pei Ayin Lamed, because as a guttural letter, Ayin can't be doubled with a dagesh. But I usually write it with one anyway, don't tell anyone, because that doubled middle radical is the real telltale sign of the PL binyan. So here's a couple examples. Shava in Pa'al means he broke. But in PL, shibar, hear that double bet? Shibar means he shattered. It's intensified. Shalach in Pa'al is he sent. But shilach is he sent away. Safar in Pa'al is he counted. But in PL, sipar is he recounted or told or narrated. It's a repetition of the action. So that's the PL binyan. After hitting the showers, Shoresh drives into work at the next binyan, the Hifil factory. Shoresh's job here is to make things happen. If Pa'al is the simple form and PL is intensified, Hifil is the causative binyan. The recognizable form of Hifil in the perfect third masculine singular is a prefix he with a hirik, and the hirik malay between the second and third root letters. Here are a couple examples of how a shoresh causes things to happen inside the Hifil factory. Lavash in the kal is simply he wore something. But in Hifil it becomes hilbish, he caused to wear. Or in other words, he dressed. Malach in the kal binyan is he ruled. But in Hifil, it's himlik. He caused to rule, or he crowned someone. That's the causative function of the Hifil binyan. Well, it's been an active day for Shoresh, and they could use some me time, some self-care. So Shoresh is winding down at the local spa, the Hitpael Binyan. A cucumber mask and a mud bath is just what Shoresh needs. The Pa'al, Piel, and Hifil Binyanim are all active forms. The Hitpael, on the other hand, is reflexive. That is, the subject both does and receives the action of the verb. I'll show you how that works in just a sec. The easy-to-spot signal of the Hitpael in the perfect third masculine singular is the prefixed He-Tav syllable Hit. It also has that same doubling of the second root letter that we saw in the Piel. So here's how this works. In the Hitpael, you generally do things to or for yourself. In the Piel, Hillel means he praised. But in Hitpael, that action comes back to the subject, and you get Hithalel. He praised himself. That is, he boasted. Get it? Here's another one. In Hifil, Hechazik means he caused to be strong, or he strengthened. But in Hitpael, Hitchazak is he strengthened himself. Okay, now this one's a bit different. Remember how in the Kal, halach was he walked? Well, in the Hitpael, Hithalech would be he walked himself. But it usually has the sense of walking back and forth. That is, he walked around or he paced. Sometimes Hitpael verbs can have that kind of back and forth quality. Now, there are other buildings in this city, a handful of other binyanim that we haven't yet explored. But that's probably enough of an introduction to give you a sense of how the different binyanim nuance the basic meaning of a verb's shoresh. We've looked at Pa'al, Piel, and Hifil, the active binyanim, which express the simple, intensive, and causative expressions of a shoresh. We've also looked at the reflexive Hitpael binyan, which is grammatically speaking also an intensive form. Note that doubled middle root letter. Now, each category also has a related passive binyan, in which the action of the verb is done to the subject. In English, we use the to be verb to express passive forms. The note was written, the glass was smashed, or the queen was crowned. In Hebrew, that passive sense is embedded in the form of the verb itself in three passive binyanim called nif'al, pu'al, and hof'al. So these are the 7 most common binyanim, though there are a few others that pop up from time to time. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the binyanim. Check out other tutorials on my channel, and please subscribe and leave feedback. But remember, if you want to get the most out of your Hebrew learning, Ehavu et ha'ivrit shelachem. Love your Hebrew.
Okay, so let's kind of walk through it again. I like the video. Let me turn the speaker off here so we don't get feedback. There we go. I like the video. For the first time going through it, it's still going to be confusing and a little overwhelming, but we're going to go back through it slowly. They present it in a stem. Is also called a binyan. Now, remember we said to make it plural, you add the im, the hirik yod with the mem. So that's the binyanim. That's what he kept saying over and over. Okay. Now he calls the root the shurik. That's just the Hebrew word for root. And he made a little character out of the shurik. I thought that was pretty cute. And then he showed how the binyanim, the stem, functions differently, basically by changing the root or modifying the vowels or putting some other consonants before or within the root. So using the example he didn't want to use, you have the root. We use this very same example in our Greek, right? And you have the stem or the binyan, the binyanim, and those are really what we're going to focusing on. Okay, we're going to introduce the conjugate, I have to look at it, make sure I pronounce it right. Conjugations But we're not going to spend much time in the conjugations until we get to the stems themselves. Now, the stem by itself doesn't tell you much until you add the conjugation to it. That's what it tells you how it functions in the sentence. Whether it's functioning perfect, perfected, would be past form. Whether it's function, like he said, intensively past or intensively present or intensively future, or simple action, past, present, or future. I hate to use past, present, or future. Hebrew doesn't emphasize time as much, but we'll get to that later. And so what we're going to focus on is the root and the binyan, or the stem. Most grammars are going to call it stem. They don't use binyan much anymore. In the newer grammars, they just call it the stem. You'll see that. But you also see some places refer to the binyan. That's the same thing. And again, we're dealing with the root. And remember, we started very early on. We said we got root position 1, root position 2, and root position 3. And we also have what's called the pay, the ayin, and the lamet positions, the pa'al. And those are just root position 1, root position 2, and root position 3. Now, don't focus on, I want to emphasize the consonants that are used here momentarily, not yet. But any consonants go in there, okay? We're just using this as a basically a learning tool. But it's often called, root position 1 is called the pay, and root position 2 is also called the ayin, and root position 3 is called the lamet, so the pa'al. And we could put in front of that, we could add various consonants to and vowels to change how it's used. We can add consonants to it to change how it functions as perfected or imperfect. Perfected means past. Imperfected means ongoing. And so it's not different. It's different than in Greek. You have perfect and imperfect tenses. These are not the same thing. Perfected in Hebrew is past. Imperfected is ongoing. And those are the ones we're going to focus on the most. But that's part of the conjugation. The vowel patterns are part of the stem. When you have the root letters, carries the basic meaning, but until you add the vowels to it, you don't really know what it's being mean, because you don't know if it's being intensified or simple or passive or you don't know until you put the vowels to it. And that tells you that how that root then is functioning as a word, a verb in a sentence. So does that make a little sense so far? You've seen this before. We're just talking about how we use it with verbs. Basically, I'm going to point here. R1 is the pay position. R2 is the ayin position. R3 is the lamet position. You can add a stem or conjugation into it, or you can add vowel patterns to the stem. You can add vowels in the stem. The stem is modified by adding a prefix or the vowel patterns, or both, is what I'm trying to say. Or the conjugation, which is how it, well, we'll get to that in a moment. And so when we look at the root, the sharish, I can't even remember how I pronounce it now. Sharush. So here we have melech, the mem, lamet, kaf, that's the root. Carries the meaning of the king generally. But you see the noun, there's several nouns, we're only showing 3 of them, which actually you could build different words from. Melech is king. We've seen before, Makah is queen, and Makut is kingdom, and there's also rule or reign and these other things. But the verb is built from there. And so the simple form of the verb is malak. Notice the kanates and the padik underneath it. That is to reign. That is the verb form. And so the verbal contains the basic meaning, the semantic information. And it tells what this verb means, and when it's put in its form there, the stem form. And so you have these 7 stems or 7 binyanim. We'll go down the English spelling on the left-hand column. The call, the nifal, the pl, the pual, the hifal, the hofal, and the hifayel. Those are the 7. Now, we're only going to focus on the first 5, the call, the nifal, the pl, the pual, the hifal. And what's embedded in there are 2 things, the verbal voice and the type of action. Verbal voice meaning it's past or present, and the type of action, whether it's simple or intensified or causative, or these kind of things. So, and then you have this spelling of the call, the nifal, the pl, the pual, the hifal, the hopal, and the hipal, the English spelling on the left and the Hebrew spelling on the right. And so you see call on the Hebrew spelling, the kaf, the lamed, or excuse the kaf lamed, kaf with the padik underneath it and the lamed. And then you have the nifal, and then underneath that the PL, and then the pual, and then the hepel, and then the hafal, or hopal, excuse me, that would be actually the, there's the comments on two, hotu comments. So that's a short O. So that's hopal, and then the hepal. And here's what to me is fascinating. Now, in our video, the narrator called this call, he said it's also typically called the pa'al, right? That's that or the pay, the ayin, and the lamed, the pa'al. Well, that's the old grammars. Almost all the new grammars refer to as the call. Call means simple or something, I forget now, but basically it's a simple form. It's all built from this simple form. But to understand it, you have to look at the pa'al. So the pa'al I put in red, the pa'al, notice you got the pay with the comments underneath it, the ayin with the padik underneath it, and the lamed. But look how the nifal is built. You have the same root letters, the pay, the ayin, and the lamed, but you add it in front of it, you put noon, and then you change the vowel system. So you have the nifal. Well, the spelling in the Hebrew is the same pronunciation in the English. But I started with the same root letters, and I made the change to make it the nifal. We'll show you how that functions in a minute. The same thing, I've got my pa'al, when I change it to a PL, that is the the yod underneath the hirik underneath the pay, and the serei underneath the ayin. And he said that's the key to recognizing the PL. Well, he's correct. Now, he put in the ayin this pretend dagesh forte to doubling, because that's typically there. Typically, you'll see this form with the hirik yod, it's not the hirik yod, the hirik and the serei under the second root letter, and a dagesh forte in the second letter, but because it's a kametz, it won't take us a dagesh forte. So there's a little pattern that flows, and this pattern helps you to recognize how it's being used. That you're starting to see. I know it's all one time sort of a fire hose, but there's a pattern. If you look at the pual, see the pattern. I still got the same root letters, but now I'm using the kibitz for the u, and the kametz underneath it for not the kametz, the padik underneath for the second root letter, and so that's the pual. Now the hipal has the hay with the hirik underneath, and various vowel changes to it. That's just to help you recognize it. I'm not talking about what it means yet. I'm talking about how to recognize it. Okay, so when you see that the pa'al, the nifal, the pl, the pual are using the same roots, but it's making some changes to it that are recognizable. Yes, sir, Carl.
It's always going to be left to right.
It's always right to left. Right, always right to left. In Hebrew, you're reading right to left, but in English, you're reading left to right. Yes. But let me go through a little further, and hopefully, we'll start to make a little sense for you. We're not learning all these stems or binyanim tonight. Just introducing them. Okay. In the next we got 4 weeks left after tonight. We're going to go through these 5 stems. Okay, these 5 binyanims. And you'll see how they're functioning, and it'll make a little more sense. Tonight's just an introduction, a fire hose, so that next week you go like, yeah, I heard that before. Oh, that starts to make a little more sense. In the Hebrew verb system, you have these 7 that are primarily used. and they have an active voice, a passive voice, and a reflective voice. That's the voice I meant. The voice is going to be active, passive, reflective, not future or present. I knew that one, right? Because Hebrew doesn't emphasize time. Time exists, but its emphasis is more on the action of the verb and not as much in the time. Actually, I'm doing a study on that right now, as a matter of fact. Well, it's like a middle in the Greek. Basically, it's something you do that impacts you personally. So if I close the door on my hand, then I close the door in my hand. It's something. If I dress myself, I wash myself. It's something I did. I physically did, but it comes back on me. So that's reflective. It can have an active voice, you can have a passive voice, you can have a reflective voice. Notice the only ones that have an active voice are the call, the PL, the hipal. That's the only ones. The only ones that have a passive voice are the nifal, the puel, and hopal. The only ones that have reflective is also the nifal. So the nifal can function with either a passive or reflective voice. Passive means it's something that's done to me. Reflective means it's something I did that actually comes back on me or impacts me. The hipal is the hipal is an intensive action, a reflective voice. You can have a simple action, intensive action, or causative action. So you see three, or actually two, the call and nifal is simple action. Simple means, I closed the door. Intensive would be I slammed the door. Intensive would be is I broke the glass. Simple, I broke the glass. And intensive would be I smashed the glass. It's more intensive or repetitive, something you did over and over again. Causative would be something you caused to happen. That's why you're showing a manufacturing line, something that are physically causing to occur. So the hipel can be causative, but in the active voice. The hopel is causative, but in the passive voice. So does this make a little sense? Okay, so this is how verbs function in the sentence. And this is how you know its function. So recognizing the call, the nifal, the PL, the pual, the hipal, the hopal, and the hipal is important because once you recognize it, you know, oh, for example, when he said, forget the word, he walked, past tense, call, simple, he walked. It's simple, call, he walked. But it's perfect tense. I don't use tenses. It's perfect conjugation. Perfect conjugation means past. He walked. Imperfect would be he is walking. And that would be a different conjugation. But here we have recognizing the patterns, and that's what he was trying to show in the video, was the various pattern changes to the roots, especially with the vowels, but also by adding some prefixes to it. So you can see that the vowel changes is actually how you pronounce the name, the English name of the verb, and this is just the names of the verbs now, by the way. That's all we're talking about. Okay, and by recognizing those changes or those vowel patterns, then you can recognize how that verb is functioning in the sentence, what voice it has, active, passive, reflective, whether it's a simple action, or intensive action, repetitive action, or causative action. And that's all you're really dealing with. So once you sort of get that down, it becomes pretty simple. Now, the thing that makes it complex is the variations in the spelling because of the gutturals. Gutturals are weak. And because they're weak, they will often change, and it causes a lot of variation. And so when you look at a matrix, which I didn't give you because I don't want to scare you, when you look at a matrix for all the different vowel systems, it's pretty long because there's so many different variations. You can have a guttural in the first root position. If you have a guttural in the second root position, what if you have a guttural in the third root position? Those vowel patterns can change, and that makes it a little more complex. But let's keep it simple and just recognize the basic, and you can build on that someday with the gutturals. So we're looking at, for example, and we're still looking at the binyanim, the stem, the kal, the nifal, the pl, the pual, the hipal, the hopal, and hipal. And so in the call or the pa'al, remember pa'al is the same thing as a call. For example, the Hebrew word shama is he heard. It's a very simple action, active voice. It's also in the past. It's the perfect. So this is the call is typically found when you look in the lexicon, third masculine singular, perfect. And so it's that would be the form it's found in. The nipal is going to take the exact same thing and put it in a passive form. It's still active, or excuse me, still simple. And so instead of he heard, he was heard. And all it did is made it passive. So recognizing the call or the pa'al from the nipal is significant to know how it functions in the sentence. And that's all that's doing. It's really that basic. But it's just a lot to it. And tonight's a fire hose. So as we go through it, you'll see how it functions a little better, hopefully. And to then take the another word, shiber. Shiber is the PL form. And notice, this is what he was trying to describe. Notice in shiber, there's a hirik under the first root position, under the shavah. Right? Here. There's a sere under the second root position. And there's a dagesh forte in that second root position. That's the pattern. That's it for the PL. Now, sometimes that pattern isn't as visible because, like he said, if that second root position was a guttural, it wouldn't take that dagesh forte there. And so you'd still see the hirik under the first and the sere under the second, under the shavah and under the not shavah, the shin, not the shavah, the center shin, and under the bait. So the first root, second root position, and that tells you it's the PL. So he smashed into pieces, for example. Well, if you go to the pual, notice that the shavah, the shin, is got the kibbutz underneath it, and it's got the potic underneath the bait with the dagesh forte in the bait. That's the pattern for the pual. And so you have the oo sound and the ah sound. Pual. You get the ooh-ah sound, right? Up in the PL, you got the EL. And so that would be that pattern sound. And so this would be shubar. Instead of he smashed into pieces, it'd be here it was smashed into pieces. So it's intensive action, but it's passive in form. It's not something he did, was done to him. The hipel, there's the here we have the word himlik. He made someone king. It's causative action. So he made king. He made somebody to be the king. It's a causative action. And the hopal, notice the pattern. You got this the comments or the I went blank here. I have to go back and look. Yeah, comments out too. That's where I was going. Okay, that's the comments out too. Then it has an O sound to it, and so this would be homelock, homelock, and so he was made king. Also passive, but it was excuse me, more reflective. He was made king. No, wait. Not reflective. I can't remember now. Causative action, not reflective. Passive. He was made king. And then you have Hit Chabe. Hit Chabe. That's the Hippael. Notice the Hippael. Look at the vowels. All right, let me go to the English spelling. In the English spelling, you have the H-I. There's the vowel. In the the Hebrew spelling, look at the hirik underneath. There's the I. In the English spelling, the next vowel is the A and then the E. Well, under the Hebrew, you have the potic and then the A, so or E sound. So the A and the E. So you have the hikabe. Hikabe. He hid himself. It's the reflective. It's something he did actively that impacts and comes back on him. He hid himself. Make a little sense? A little bit, right? Not totally lost, but just a little lost. Okay. All right. So that's how the binyanim, the stems, function. They tell you really, there's two things you get out of this. If you can recognize it, you're going to get the voice, active, passive, reflective. If you can recognize it, you're going to find the type of action, simple, intensive, or causative. That's what you get out of the stem and the binyanim, okay? And then you have the conjugation. Well, there are really 6 conjugations. We're only going to focus on 2. Time is not going to allow us to do all of them. And we're going to look at the perfect and imperfect. A perfect is a completed action in the past. It's completed, has to be past. The perfect aspect denotes completed action, whether past, present, or future. Mostly it's past. That's why we always have an ED on it. Ending. Imperfect is an incomplete action. Denotes incomplete action, whether past, present, or future. Normally it's ongoing, but sometimes it's future. The conjugations of the Hebrew verbal system expresses different verbal functions. There are 6 of them, and so anyway. So we're going to focus on perfect and imperfect. Imperative. Imperative is pretty much like in the Greek. It's imperative. It's command. Okay. Infinitive construct phase and infinitive absolute. Now, an infinitive is a verbal noun. We didn't do infinitives in Greek. Just not enough time to do it all. Okay. But they have them, and they're the same thing. It's a verbal noun. Basically, it's taking a verb and meshing it with a noun. So it has both a verbal function and a noun function. And generally speaking, it's almost always for infinitive is going to be just say you add the preposition to, to wash, to go, to do, to learn. That's typically how you translate it. But it can be an absolute form. A noun could be absolute, right? A noun could be construct. So it could be infinitive construct or infinitive absolute. And so there's 2 different conjugations for that. But there's also a participle. Now, a participle, like an infinitive, is a verbal noun. A participle, though, is a verbal adjective. Remember, adjectives can function as a modifying a noun and giving a descriptive form, a good man. Good is the adjective, man is the subject. A good man. Or it can function in what's called a predicate way. That is, that it's giving information about how it functions in a verbal form. A man is good. And so the adjective can function, basically, it's in a predicate form. In other words, it's associated with the predicate is the verb and everything that follows it. That's the predicate. So a man is good. But typically an adjective can also function as a substantival that is functioning as a noun, good, bad, the other. The movie with the Clint Eastwood, right? Good, bad, and the ugly. Those are all adjectives, but they're functioning as a subject. And but a participle is really a verbal adjective. It's a verb meshed together with an adjective, so it has both characteristics of it, and it expresses something. In English, we typically put ing after it. Studying, learning, those are participles. And so we're not going to focus on the imperative, the infinitive construct, or the infinitive absolute of the participle in this class, but just so you're aware that they are part of the conjugation. So if you go back to the tree and you think about the tree form, the tree form, you have the root of the shurish, and of course the root carries the basic meaning. You have the stem or the binyan or binyanim, plural, and those are what we saw as the 7 different stems, the call, we'll go this one. The call, the nipal, the pl, the pual, the hipal, the hopal, the hipal. And they basically tell you how it functions and what voice is being used and what type of action is being used. So you get those 2 things. The verbal voice, active, passive, or reflective, and the type of action, that is simple action, intensified action, or causative action. And then you have on top, and this is where it gets a little complex, because every single one of those binyamims, every single one of those stems can have any and all of those. Remember, there's 6 different conjugations, 6 of them. So all 7 of those can have those 6 different conjugations. And so this could look like a pretty a bushy tree, a lot of leaves to it. But really, if you break it down in this simple, you have the binyan, the 7 we talked about, and the 6 different conjugations that can be attached to any one of those binyans or to those stems. And so that's why, to me, this picture adds value to think about in that sense. The building also does. I really like that because binyan means building, and that's why he did it that way. It's the building block which you're applying the verb from to. Okay, does that make sense? A little bit. We're not totally lost, just a little lost, right? So next week, what we'll do is we'll spend some time actually looking at the call or the pa'al binyan or stem, and we'll show how that is used and works. And we're going to move away from the alphabet and away from the nouns and focus predominantly on the verbs. So let's talk a little bit more about reading a very famous verse. Anybody brave enough to try to pronounce any of the words in here? Pick a word. There's a couple of words you might want to recognize. We've had them more than once. Okay, one in particular we've had several times. Anybody online? How about the second word? We should recognize the second word. Throughout all the Bible, we typically translate it Lord.
Elohim.
Well, Elohim is the translation we use because the word is actually Yahweh. So we don't, out of reverence to God, His name, they don't pronounce the name Yahweh. They're not even sure how it was really pronounced. Actually, I find it very difficult to pronounce it in terms of syllables, syllabification. But you ought to be able to recognize that one, Yahweh. And of course, we often pronounce that as not Elohim, but Adonai. And that we translated as Lord. So when you go in Genesis 1, they'll have Yahweh, and they'll pronounce, no, excuse me, I got it backwards. I can't remember now. Genesis 1 will have either Elohim, and they pronounce it, and they insert God. And then in Genesis 2, they'll have Elohim Yahweh. So it'll be Lord God, or be Yahweh Elohim. So they will pronounce it as Lord God. So the first word, anyone want to try to pronounce it? You have the bait, a hard bait with the doggish lane in it. So with the hirik under. How do you pronounce that sound? Just the bait with the hirik. Don't have to do the word. Yeah, that's right. Go ahead and say it out loud. Well, not the ah sound, but the hirik has a if sound, right? Like in bitter. So bit. And then you have the ka with the sereh, and so the sereh has more of the, and this is where I always get confused. This is not my, I've always said that more of an A sound, but it's probably more of an E sound. But it's, and it has the more ki, and so it's beki, bekesh, or I've always said bekesh, excuse me, I've always said bekesh, but I think it's probably more correct to say bekish. Bekish is the first word. Yahweh, or typically they don't say Yahweh, they would actually say Adonai. And then you have this next word. It's actually a preposition and with what's called a pronominal suffix. This is added to it. The lamet is the preposition lamet, which means two or four. And that's I'm going to show you in a minute that whole Bob there is means two or four himself. And then you have, and what about this word? We've had this word before several times, multiple times, as a matter of fact. The aleph with the hirik under, the hirik yod, it's a hirik yod vowel, and then the shim, hirik yod, aleph, hirik yod, and shim is, how do you pronounce that? No sound for the aleph, so you're just doing the vowel. E, sh, ish. Man. There you go. Ish, man, right? And then you've got this last word here. This is also the preposition, the kaf, The actual root is going to be the lamed bait, and then it's going to have this here, this hole and bob at the end. This hole and bob is going to function just as the hole and bob did up here with the lamed, the low. But here, this is kil bavo. Kil bavo. It's not ba, excuse me, kil bavo. It's not the B, it's the soft B. So it's kil bavo. Kil bavo. And so this would be Bikesh, Yahweh lo ish kil bavo. Anyone know what that is? It's a very famous verse. It's written on people's houses. It's actually only part of the verse. It's not the whole verse. This is just the part that's recognizable. No, okay, but you got Lord or Lord here, right? You got man here, and you don't recognize the others, right? But you got two, okay? And I've already told you that this is a preposition for him, for himself, kind of thing. So we're getting there. So let's just do it in a syllabification syllables. This is an open syllable with the consonant and the vowel. That's an open syllable. So that's big. And then you have a closed syllable because it ends in a consonant. I'm pointing here that the people online can't see. So the bat is, I forget you can't see. That's the fallacy of this process. The bat is a open syllable, but the closed syllable is the cough excuse me, the compensatory and the shim. That's a closed syllable because it ends with a consonant. So every consonant has a vowel, and it's either going to be open or closed. If it's open, it ends in a vowel. If it's closed, it ends in a consonant, and that's what you have. Bakesh. And then you have, now I'm not real sure, I struggle with, I don't really know how to, because we don't really know the pronunciation, and I struggle with the pronunciation or the syllabification, the dividing of Yahweh. But if I write it in English, that's how I would pronounce it, and that's how I would do the syllables, but it doesn't really seem to fit the rules, so I don't really know the answer there. Lo is monosyllabic. Ish is monosyllabic. Now we have kil. That is the kilvavo. The first syllable is the cough with the here and the consonant. It's a silent, called a silent shabbat there because you don't pronounce the vowel sound to it. So that's kill, and then you have again a consonant with a vowel. That's a open syllable, and then you have another consonant with a vowel. That's also an open syllable. And so that's kilvavo, excuse me. And if we were to break it down one more time and look at the roots are in blue. Now, I didn't do the root for Ish or Yahweh because I really didn't research what the root is, but the root for Yahweh is without the vowel letters. It'd be the, what they would just go Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. There'd be no Shabbat or no Kamates underneath it. It'd be Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. A lot of times that's what people will say. They won't even say Adonai. They'll just say Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. They won't say Yahweh. They'll say Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. They'll just pronounce the letters because the root is just the letters. And so the blue is the root. So the bait, the kaf, and the shem is the root for bikesh, Yahweh. Now the red is going to be the a prefix or suffix. Actually, I should have probably put the lamed here in a red too, because it's really a prefix. In this case, it's the preposition inseparable, but because it has the, I don't get too complex, but basically it probably should have done in red as well. But it makes it more confusing. Anyway, so you have a preposition under the red for the key, kill, vavo, and the key preposition typically means like, or as, or according to. And so right now we can know, and I'll tell you that lavav means heart. Kikesh Kikesh means to seek, or in past tense would be he sought. So we have the Lord, Yahweh, right? Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. The Lord is the subject, and what he do? He sought. Lo, for himself. The Lord sought for himself, Ish, a man, Ki, like, as, or according to, but we almost always, English translations say after, and I'm going to talk about that later, because that's not really accurate. After, lavo, after his own heart. Right? 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. Now, that's not the whole verse, that's just a portion of it. And so we have the Lord sought for himself a man, and we normally say after his own heart. Right? Make sense? You see how it kind of comes together? Now, I realize you got to break it into pieces, but that's what you do until you start to become familiar with it. You can kind of walk through it. I still have to break it into pieces because if I'm reading the Hebrew, I can't just pull it out and read it. I got to stop and put it in pieces. Okay, I recognize this, or I look this up and that kind of stuff. Until you do a lot of time with it and become fluent with it, you just have to go slow with it. So, let me see what I got next real quick. Okay, let's take a break here because I think this is the end of that. Yes, I believe it is. It is. Let's take a break and then we'll finish up here. 5 minutes. Come here about 25 till. So that's like a 7-minute break thereabouts. All right, let's get started again. Okay, so we structured our study, our lessons to look at first the grammatical lesson, and then we move to exegetical principles, and then before we get to actually practical exegesis. And so we want to kind of carry what we learned in grammar through. Hopefully tonight we'll do some of that. As we look at the exegetical principles, we've been looking at the perspective from Jason DiRucci and how to understand and apply Old Testament 12 steps from exegesis to theology. And it's pretty deep in terms of what I suggest that every time you do a word study, you can go through every single one of these. Maybe not, but we should be aware that if we're really going to dive deep into the word, we're going to look beyond just a simple word study. And that's the whole point of the class, is being able to use the tools to be able to go deeper than just looking at the word itself. And so we looked in, I forget the book we were looking at before, but this one is How to Understand and Apply Old Testament 12 Steps from Exegesis to Theology. And he has 5 different steps. Actually, there's I think 12 chapters of these 5 steps. And I've been summarizing them. We looked at the text and what the makeup of that passage is. We looked at observation, Tacoma, that is the text, observation, context, meaning, and application. We looked at the text. We looked at the observation as how the passage is communicated. And then tonight we'll look at the context. Where does the passage fit? Now, some of this we've already done when we're looking and doing the elementary Greek stuff. But there's some additional depth that I think he provides as value added. And so let's look at some of that. But the goal is to understand 2 things. Number one, under the context, where does this passage fit? Like I said, we've looked at this in the last section when we were doing the Greek. And we're typically understand there's a historical perspective and understanding what this passage fits in the scheme of things. But the goal is twofold. Number one, understand the historical situation from which this author composed the text and identify his historical, and for us, identify his historical details that he mentions or assumes. In other words, the author is going to include some information, and that if we're really astute, understand that the author is writing from a perspective that he has a view, a worldview, assumptions. And his audience have typically the same worldview and the same assumptions. They're in sync with each other. We're not. We weren't in that age. So the historical background, the historical events, the politics, the powers to be, the people involved, we don't have the same degree of familiarity. So it takes a little more effort on our part to look at how does this passage fit and from a historical perspective. The other goal is to comprehend the role that the passage plays in the whole book, the literary perspective. How does it fit in the entire book as well as in the more mega narrative of the whole Bible, or New Testament or Old Testament of the whole Bible. Let's talk about first the historical context. There are 6 key questions. We're probably used to these, so we'll spend a lot of time with who. That is the author, the audience, the major figures. It's not just the author, but what are the other major figures in the text? Are there any other major figures? I mean, Pilate was a major figure in the crucifixion of Jesus and his response to Jesus' statements and questions. And of course, the Sanhedrin were major figures. And so these are other major figures and other powers. The Sanhedrin were a power themselves, so was Pilate, as well as the Roman Empire or the Assyrian Empire or the Babylonian Empire, the Egyptians, and these kind of things. These are other historical background information that the author will bring out that the audience he's writing to and the author had a perspective, a worldview with, say, that power, the Assyrian power, Babylonian power, Egyptian power. Yeah, Carl.
I was with the genealogy of the text, and it shows me like this person's father. Like I'm studying Jonah's son, Jonah's father, Jonah's son of Domingue. That goes with me. That always traces back the lineage. People see back to where it goes back even to Jesus.
Sure, and the fascinating thing when you look at genealogy in the Bibles, every single case it's there for a purpose, and there's a structure to it. By the way, I'm not an expert at it. I've looked at it a long time, so I don't want to try to ad lib on it. But there is a structure to it, and it's there for a purpose. And it's not just to give the history, although that's important. But generally speaking, it's pointing to. Like you say, oftentimes pointing to Christ, or pointing to maybe the Levite priesthood, or whatever the case may be. So you're right, Carl. So the who is who the author is, not just the author, but its audience, the major figures and powers. The when, for example, is the original date of the message. Now, a lot of times we put a lot of emphasis on the date, and sometimes the date really matters. In my view, there are other cases where the date is not significant, but that's an opinion. Some people spend a lot of effort with the date, and for me, it's the date does have an impact in terms of the audience. If you think about Revelation, for example, Revelation was written in a Nero period, say before Nero's reign ended in AD 68, I think it was, and of course that's associated with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. These kind of things. So maybe Nero was in 66, I don't remember. And then, of course, Domitian and ended in 98, I think it was. He went from 86 to 98 or something of that nature, 84 to 98, I think. And so these can have significance in terms of the audience and the events that are ongoing. In other cases, the date, whether Galatians was first or First Thessalonians was first, probably not as significant. But there's a general time frame which are all written. It may be significant in the sense that, for example, in Galatians there are a lot of polemical or not argumentative, but those who are the Jewish. I'm trying to think of the right words coming into the Jewish Christians that were coming into the Galatian churches to stir up trouble, to suggest that they honor certain aspects of Jewish rituals, the Sabbath, the circumcision, and such of these things nature. Timing may have a factor in terms of how long that church has been in existence, whether it's just came into existence or it's been in a long term into existence. In other words, Corinth, for example, is how long they've been in existence before they started falling away. Was it immediately? These kind of things. So that could have an impact, is my point. But I don't typically put as much emphasis. That's my opinion. Others do. So the original date of the message in relationship to the major periods of power, in other words, the Roman Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and so dates can play. There could be a crossover. Daniel was through both the Nebuchadnezzar and the Medo-Persian Empire, so he was involved for 70 years there in Babylon. The where, the physical location, geography pointed to the text, that can make a difference. In Galatians, people make a big deal whether it's southern Galatia that they're writing to or northern Galatia. Northern Galatia, whether or not Paul was, is more higher in the mountain, whether he had to go into the mountains near Antioch to get away from a fever, because it's cooler, to get his fever down. So the topography can make a difference. The geography can make a difference. And sometimes those are brought out by the author. We're not typically familiar with it. It takes more effort on our part to gain the same level of familiarity that he and the audience have. The why, what is the purpose of the message? Why is he writing this message in the first place? Why do we got 3 synoptic gospels effectively saying almost the same thing? Well, they're written to different audiences, number one. Okay, there's other reasons too. And why is John's gospel so different? Why is he writing? We already have 3 of them. What do we need John's for? Well, John emphasizes, of course, the divinity of Christ. So the message of why he's writing. Why did Paul write Corinthians? Well, 1 Corinthians 7 tells us the answer to that. Chloe sent some questions or some issues to him, and he was responding to those. And of course, you get into a look at how many letters he actually wrote for the Corinthians, and whether it was 3 or 4, we only had 2, and this kind of stuff. And then the how, the genre, and the thought and the flow of the passage. At stake here is to answer the question, why did he say it that way? Is there a reason he used this language versus another language, or another, not language, but another approach kind of thing? So in these first 5 questions, we'll get to the 6th one in a minute. We gain answers to these mostly from a very good reading of the biblical text itself. The more we understand the Bible as a whole, the better we can understand the details and its parts associated with the whole. The better we're aware of the ancient context, the easier for us to cross the bridge from our modern world to their world. And so it's more than a word study. It's understanding the context in which the author and the audience lived, and applying that or understanding that so you can apply it, understand how it's applied to them so that you can properly apply it to yourself. Number 6, key question is what? Here, the focus is less on what is said, but more on what is assumed between the author and the audience. Again, there's a lot of worldviews, perspectives that exist that you and I aren't part of. If I grew up in Europe, well, you lived in England for a long time, Eddie, and so you might have some worldviews or something. We're talking about healthcare, driving up here, right? So his view of healthcare is, I'm going to say, jaded, because he comes from a European perspective, and that's not correct. That's not fair. And so we were talking about the difference in healthcare and whether or not a government healthcare system would be better here, the cost of it, and this kind of stuff. None of that matters. But see, he comes from a different perspective, worldview, having lived with a different system versus what we've had here. And although I've lived in Europe, I've never really had to use I've always was over there as a military person, not always, but most often as a military person. And when I used the healthcare system as the military, so basically I was functioning in the U.S. military system. Whether it was a European or not, it still got that same service. So the differences between that we were talking about, different worldviews, in other words. There are shared assumptions that exist between the author and the audience that are clear to them, but are not as clear to us. God's word was spoken through human words in history. It's not our time, it's their time. Every biblical book was conditioned by the very language they used, where they spoke in Aramaic, where they spoke in Greek, or where they spoke in Hebrew. And the culture that exists. There's a big difference between the culture of, say, Moses versus maybe Isaiah or Daniel or Paul or Saul. A very big difference in time frame and culture and the situations of the time that existed. Those aren't things that we're familiar with. It takes more effort to understand that background and apply it properly. So it's not just a word study, it's a study of the word. And there's a big difference. For example, if you were a 21st century reader today and you didn't have an understanding or grasp of clean and unclean law from the Leviticus text book, specifically Leviticus 15 and such, Ezekiel's comparison to Israel to a woman in her menstrual impurity would likely make it very difficult for you to understand when he talks about Ezekiel 36, verse 17, when he compares the state of Israel to a woman's menstrual state. Well, it's the impurity that is represented there. And of course, to know that, you really have to look at Leviticus 15 and how the menstrual state of a woman makes her unclean during that period. The flow of the blood makes her unclean. Similarly, if you're not already aware of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books discussion on the Levirate marriages, Deuteronomy 25 talks about, the process in which Boaz redeemed Ruth seemed quite strange in Ruth chapter 4. But because, he removes his sandal and gives it to another party to transform, to confirm the action. Well, that's something we have no familiarity with. I mean, if I remove my sandal, in some places it's an offense. If I go to my daughter-in-law's house, I'm supposed to take our shoes off. I don't really like that. I prefer to keep my shoe on. But there's different cultures and different perspectives, but understanding what's behind that is significant to recognize what they were doing and what it meant to them. There's also a linguistic familiarity. Every biblical author assumed that his words would be understood. Everyone did. God's words are not confusing. I forget the passage now. I'm going blank here. But they had a shared knowledge of either the Hebrew, the Aramaic, or Greek. So they had an understanding of the language that they were using. Well, we don't. It's an important reason for us to at least dive into and get familiar with the language that they wrote and used. So taking this class, and I really commend you for the effort, because it really can add a lot to your understanding down the road. Also, there's a different worldview. I already touched on this, shared values, perspectives, a mindset that the writer and the recipients and the key figures and that are mentioned in the story and the society that they lived in. And there's also social and economic systems that they had that we don't have. I mean, just looking at the economic systems and the denarius and the different, the 2 mites that the widow threw into the treasury and the different payment that Abraham used to buy the cave for the burial of Sarah and these kind of things. There's also societal changes and difference in relationships that relative to everyday life. A class just on the New Testament Christian and how they lived, or the Roman Empire and how they dressed, can add to your understanding of what the author is saying to the audience. And when Peter girded up his loins, well, what's he doing? Well, basically, he's taking his outer garment and wrapping it between his legs so that he can move quicker. They had longer, garments that draped over their legs, and if he's going to work in the fields or he's going to move quicker, they're going to basically gird that up in their loins. They're going to wrap it around their underwear and this kind of thing. Behavioral patterns such as the dress and community of family customs, the political climate, the governmental powers and centers. For example, in Revelation, it's not just the Roman Empire that's a political power. It's the supporting factions of the Roman Empire that are a significant factor of the events that occur in Revelation. Loyalties and other structures that exist, the Jewish synagogues and the life around the synagogue, someone being casted out of the synagogue. What does that mean in person? When you think about discipline in the Lord's church, that kind of background is an understanding. It has to do with they were so closely tied to the relationship with one another as part of the synagogue, as a community, as a family. To be cast out would in fact jeopardize your livelihood and ability to survive. So in the same way, church discipline, we should be such a family that to be separated from is painful. Unfortunately, we have a Western societal perspective and view which tries to put distance between you and I. I don't want to sit elbow to elbow in the pews. I like a little breathing room, give me a little more elbow room, right? But that's not the case in most Eastern societies or other cultures where they're comfortable shoulder to shoulder and such a type thing. And so these things play a part. And so understanding the social differences that exist and distinctions that exist, it plays a big difference in understanding the author's context that he's writing and the audience perception of it. Religious practices, the convictions, the rituals, the afflictions and the sacred structures associated with Israel's worship and the neighbors, the different altars they set up and Samaria set up the 2 altars they set up, and I'm going blank of where they were, but and the significance around those and these kind of things, and of course, why did these Israelite kings migrate towards these pagan gods and their altars and Baal and such, and understanding that background between those pagan gods actually helps to understand the author and the audience's perspective on things. So understanding the historical context and these 6 key questions are really significant. Generally speaking, we don't want to just gloss over them, but it takes a lot of time. Like I said, there's more to a word study than just studying the word or just studying a word, but it's studying the word and God's word and whole. And it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. It's not an overnight event. Also, in historical context, there are key spheres of which things are done. A proper grasp of the linguistic signs. The original languages as part of the historical context. We've already touched on, the Hebrew, Aramaic. And so just taking classes like this or taking classes into elementary Hebrew, elementary Greek will add to your ability to understand and grasp the environment and the people. We live, 2,000 plus years, or actually if you're going back to Moses or Abraham, Noah, you're talking about 4,000 or more years, a bridge between us. And so understanding the language that they use or they wrote, at least as close as we're able to get, helps us to bridge the gap in somewhat. There's also a grasp of the person, the institutions, and the events of the scripture. We can understand the Bible, but it does take a lot of work to dive deeper. In Paul's words to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2, verse 7, he says we must think or consider scripture, confident that the Lord will give understanding in everything. We are God-dependent upon our ability to discern, to think, to use logic, to provide, to think through and in our study. The more we recognize the key persons, the institution, the events, the better the interpretations will be. The more we know, the less we need to rely on secondary sources for help. For example, let me give you an example. Knowing Israel's covenantal history and its relationship with the neighboring nations helps us to grasp the prophets' numerous public condemnation. So understanding that history behind Israel and their continual, their covenant history that God made with them and their agreement to that history and the relations they made with the neighboring. Why did Israel often seek help from Egypt or from Assyria or from the Romans? And because they should have maintained their dependence and loyalty to God. Instead, they thought, why did Saul build these relationships with his, was 800 wives and 1,000 concubines or something like that? I forget now. These are nation relationship building. And that was not necessary when you have dependence on God. The Pentateuch was the foundational scripture of the Old Testament, of the prophets, the priests, the poets, for many of the New Testament authors, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so the more familiar you are with those foundations, the more we appreciate the structure that's built on them. Listen, most people don't want to study Leviticus or even Deuteronomy. They're pretty, dry, let's say, okay? A lot of rules and stuff. And I don't remember all the 600 some odd rules kind of thing. But understanding that gives us a much greater understanding of the author's perspective when he's writing, especially in the New Testament. Jesus refers, of course, using the Septuagint more than anything else, to those laws. He, I think, refers to the Psalms and Isaiah more than any of that, but still the Pentateuch as well. There's a general awareness of life in this created world. When you think about, for example, in Proverbs 6, verse 6, go to the ant, O sluggard, consider the ways, her ways, and be wise. It'd be a good thing to understand what it means to go to the ant, O sluggard, is referring to. So spend time understanding the natural world that God has created, that he uses in his text to bring out certain perspectives or points. In Psalm 19, verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Well, if you look up in the sky, you can see the majesty of God. I do often every night. And but really, if you really want to understand his majesty, look beyond the sky, look beyond the stars, look beyond his. I mean, you see his creation, his handiwork throughout. In Isaiah 40, verse 26, lift up your eyes on high and see who created these. We see God's majesty in his creation throughout. Jesus said in Matthew 6, verse 26, look at the birds of the air, consider the lilies of the field. The authors use God's creation in explaining God's nature, or explaining God's word. And so it's good for us to spend some time to understand God's creation. All these statements necessitate that we become aware of life in his created world that is part of that historical context. There's also a proper approach to extra biblical data. Extra biblical data is non-biblical text. The biblical text that we have, there was a lot of other text written around it, or in addition to it, or beside it, that is maybe by the Egyptians or by the Syrians or by others, the Babylonians. I wouldn't depend upon extra biblical text, but they give you a better understanding of the world that some of those authors lived in. For example, I'm not a proponent of spending a lot of time looking at the Apocrypha, and that we call the Apocrypha, which the Catholicism refers to as Deuterocanonical. That is the second canon. Simply became because of Martin Luther protest against those books as not being canonical, not being inspired. Therefore, they formed very quickly a second meeting and made those canonical books, including First and Second Maccabees and several other books. And of course, there are a lot of pseudepigraphical books in the New Testament. Gospel of Thomas. Do I really want to spend time with those? No, but sometime can at least give you an idea of the worldview that existed during the Bible times. Now, I wouldn't want to try to apply my Bible knowledge to that, but I can understand the context of which the Bible text might apply in that same time frame. So understanding the extra biblical data takes a lot more work. Here's a good example. Ezekiel 1, the prophet unfolds a remarkable vision of God's glory depicting the heavenly beings, right? It's got this picture of the four wings, the human hands, the beings with four wings, the human hands, hands and four faces with likeness of a human, a lion, an ox, and eagle. And these are remarkable creatures which depict God's exalted above, in his throne above all, above the rainbows and all of his creation. It's very clear that the point is the culture and time that God's glory is great and he's exalted over all things. Every beast, every domestic animal, every flying creature, every human, every earthly thing, he's exalted over. That's the depiction. But if you understood the background of other, what's called extra biblical, that is outside the Bible documents, the Babylonians pagan worship gods with multiple wings and faces. And so these existed. As a matter of fact, they have discovered many that existed in that time. And it shows that Ezekiel's vision is that all the realities themselves that the Babylonians looked at, all these pagan gods with these multiple wings and multiple faces, Ezekiel's vision shows that God is supreme over all that. I mean, that's what the vision is doing. So while the essence or the general sense of these extra biblical outside the Bible passage, or the Bible is not contingent upon it, the details gave us extra information about the time frame and the context in which people lived. So there's value in understanding and learning those. Let me talk about some, I got time to finish, we're actually doing okay. Some common errors dealing with the historical context. Missing the point. There are a lot of scholars that get so enthralled and inundated, focused on looking at the historical background. You can read some of, I think it's Barclay's, so he writes significantly about the background, and he's a great commentator and author. But a lot of times, I'm not saying him, but a lot of times you get so focused on the background that you miss the text point. The background is background. It's not the message. It supports the message. And so we want to have an awareness of it, but not emphasize it. Old Testament surveys, commentators too often major on the background and not on the message itself. Don't miss the text main point. Hear the message of the scripture. The background is background. It supports the message, and it's not the message itself. Also, the second one, eliminating rather than illuminating the text. There are a lot of scholars, and this is done a lot, especially when I read some scholars on Genesis and some other texts, Deuteronomy, and they get into these very complex theories about who wrote the text, when they wrote it, how it relates to other extra biblical data, and oftentimes these theories are based on very little evidence, or maybe even debatable evidence. For example, in much of the 20th century, the study of the Psalms was dominated by what's called form critical. That is the structure of the form critical approach that looked at that assumed a very elaborate life setting in his worship for each of the different genres. The problem is that we actually find very little historical data in the Psalms or the titles of the Psalms that they can actually pull from. So these are theories, and a lot of times, a lot of people take theories as fact, and they're not. Theories are necessary and they can be helpful, but only a historical reconstruction is valid, and not a theory. When it grows out of the text itself, historical reconstruction is when it grows out of the text itself, when it reinforces rather than disturbs the apparent meaning of the text. It reinforces the text, not disturbs the meaning. And when it helps make sense of a difficult statement in the text, then there can be some values in it. Historical context illuminates rather than eliminates the biblical text. And so oftentimes some people want to look at the historical context or the various theories they come up with, and it really redefines the text in such a way that it no longer has a message that applies to you and I. And another fallacy is to emphasize similarities but not differences. This is done a lot, especially looking at extra biblical text. I know, for example, the pagan god Marduk and his creation story. They look at the similarities between that creation story and the pagan god Marduk to the Genesis creation story, and they show all the similarities. But to do that without looking at all the differences is a great disservice and inaccuracy. The similarities regularly suggest that the biblical authors wrote not only to present true doctrine, but also to confront the twisted views of Israel's pagan neighbors. The god Marduk had stories of creation, but the Genesis story, I'll say corrects, but overrides it, corrects it. Yeah, there are similarities, but there are a lot of differences. And so to look at similarities without examining the differences is going to mislead and lead astray. The best comparative work will identify both similarities and differences and considers the significance of both. So that's our point on principal exegesis tonight. So any thoughts or questions before we move into the next section? Yeah.
I find the emphasizing the similarities and not the differences interesting, because what I find a lot of like atheists and skeptics would do, they would look at similarity between, let's say, the general flood in terms of Noah's day, and they will look at it and say, okay, here is what the Egyptians said out here, and then they make the claim that it is actually these biblical writers borrowing from these pagan gods to write the Bible. So the Bible is true.
Right. So, you might have heard Eddie, but just in case, basically he's talking about, for example, Noah's day and the flood. There are other extra biblical texts that speak about and matter of fact, that's the fascinating thing when you think about it, is there's not a single society that doesn't have a depiction of this, what's the word, when it's a worldwide flood, what?
Universal flood.
Yeah, universe, but that wasn't the word I was thinking of, but no, that's not me. A deluge. So a lot of cultures have a story of a deluge, a worldwide, a universal flood kind of thing. But God's not a story, but an event that, number one, shows and corrects the writing of these pagan perspectives. And it's not that the Noah or the authors borrowed from them, but it's God showing a more complete, accurate picture of what paganism is inaccurately depicting. So I think that's a good point. You're right. Thanks. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, so let's move to our last section where we deal with practical exegesis. And I want to go back to 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. Remember what? Now we won't look at the whole verse. What was the translation?
The blessing.
Man, it was that long ago, wasn't it? The Lord has sought a man after his own heart, right? And so let's take a time and look at that a little closer from a couple of different perspectives. 1 Samuel 13, 14. If you want to go and open your Bibles there, we're going to look at a few things. I'm going to give you a picture here of different translations. Most of them are very similar. In the King James, the Lord has sought him a man after his own heart. The New King James, the Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. And remember, that's what we saw, is the Lord sought. The Lord is the subject. He sought, that is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yahweh. He sought the verb for himself. That was that the preposition, the lamed with the whole Vav as the lo, has sought for himself a man, ish, after his own heart. Now, after his own heart, we had the preposition ki, and it was the verb, or not the verb, but the noun, lavav. And so it was, lavav means heart, and ki meaning, this is where actually what we're talking about, one thing we're talking about. So the ESV has, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The NIV has, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. Very similar. In a New Living Translation, the Lord has sought a man after his own heart. Pretty much the same. And the message, that God is looking, God is out looking for your replacement right now, and this time he'll do the choosing. So let's don't throw too much disparity on the message here, because there are some things that they bring out, that, and there's a reason I want to bring this out. So if we look at, for example, back to our text, and this may look a little complex, but let me start. The middle line, which we started with, the middle line is the bikesh. That is a verb. Underneath it, you see right verb, and meaning sought. It is in the past tense, so it's sought. Now, I wrote above it the lexical form, just so you can see a little bit smaller with the parentheses, bakash. And so that's the lexical form, meaning to seek. And so bikesh. This is actually, if you remember the pattern, I know you don't. The pattern, you have the hirik underneath the first root position, and the sereh under the second root position. And so this is the PL form. And so PL is Oh, I went blank. Let me look real quick. Yeah, the PL is the intensive action or repetitive action. And so more likely here the repetitive action. The Lord has repeatedly sought after a man after his own heart. And so we have and now the way this is set up, and this is the typical sentence structure or clause structure, verb, subject, and then direct object and any modifiers, okay? That's what MOD is, modifier, DO is direct object. So you have bikesh as the verb, that is sought, the subject, Yod He Vav He, which we would say Adonai or Yahweh, the Lord. And we have the modifier, which is the preposition, the lamed, with what's called a pronominal suffix. We didn't go over any of the pronominal suffix, it's just too much. But that would be for himself. So for would be the lamed, but himself would be the whole vav. So we have Lord sought for himself, ish, the direct object, a man, and then we have the word here. We're going to spend some time looking at kil vavo. Kil vavo is breaking into three parts. That's what the parenthesis above it is. The preposition ki, and we're going to talk about what that means. And then we have the verb lexical form lavav, and that means heart. And then we have the same pronominal suffix referring to his. So the after, like, or according to his heart. So that prepositional phrase, that's what that is. It's a prepositional phrase. Ki lavo is a prepositional phrase meaning either after his heart, like his heart, or according to his heart. Most translations that we just saw has after his own heart. Almost all of them do. Okay, now the Message is not. God is looking out for your replacement right now. But let's find out why and look at it a little closer. So any thoughts about what's up here? Does this make sense? You have basically the verb, subject, and direct object is typically the clause or the sentence structure. That's the normal structure. Normally, we'll start with the verb. Doesn't mean always, but normally it does. And the subject comes after it, and any modifiers associated with that, direct object, any modifiers associated with that kind of thing. And so the lexical form I put up here so that you can see how it would look in lexical form versus how it actually looks in the text itself and its translation below it. So, and so now let's look at a couple of things. I want to focus on the preposition ki first, and then we'll look at the heart, lavav. The preposition ki in the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon says it means the like of, or like, or as. You can find some others that might say according to. What you don't find is it doesn't say after or pursuing. And so the question is why is that there? And so I want to, well, actually, I think to look at the heart is going to tell us that prepositional phrase, ki with the lavav, is going to help us understand that. Let's talk about the heart itself. First thing to notice is the preposition itself doesn't mean after. It's not, the lexical form doesn't define that. But now let's look at the heart itself, lavav. Trying to think how I want to say this. The heart can function as in an adjectival mode. Remember, an adjective can function many ways, but here the only way we're talking about is to qualify or to be descriptive of the noun it's modifying. And an adjectival, it would modify a noun. Okay, adjectives modify nouns. And so if it's modifying a noun, the typical translation says it's modifying the direct object being man. So that's what the arrows here, the up arrow identifies the direction of the modifier. So if we look from the left-hand side for you at home, I'm looking at the bottom here where you have kilavo, and the arrow pointing up to east. So that says kilavo, the prepositional phrase that is according to his heart is modifying man. It's talking about the man's heart. That's how we typically understand it, right? It's talking about the man's heart. And then you have lo, that is the prepositional phrase for himself, modifying the subject here, Yahweh sought. So for himself, Yahweh sought for himself, and so that's how you see it on the Hebrew on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you see the same thing. It's from left to right, sought Yahweh for himself. So the Lord sought for himself. That's why the arrow points up. And then you see, according to his heart, pointing up to a man. That's the modifier. It's in other words, it's modifying the heart is modifying the man, kind of thing. So adjectively modifying the direct object man, and the heart itself could refer to God's character, that is loyalty. In other words, it is a let's see back up that a minute. So these prepositional phrases or modifiers, they characterize the noun, and let's say it functions adjectively. And the prepositional phrase, like or according to his heart, adjectively would modify the man and refers to God's character or loyalty. Then the clause would mean that God has sought a man whose character or whose loyalty in some way corresponds to God's character or loyalty. In other words, David's heart is corresponds to God's character and God's loyalty. So that's what that would be interpreting. And that's the traditional reading here. I did want to back up to something when I was talking about the preposition here. That is the preposition key, meaning like or of, but not after, presuming. The English preposition can mean in pursuit of, but the says a cop went after a robber. But the Hebrew preposition key means like or according to, and never ever functions this way. It never functions after or pursuing. So it's not talking about David pursuing the character of God or the loyalty of God. It's speaking adjectively would be David, whose heart is like or according to the character or loyalty of God. And so there's that relationship that exists there. That is the traditional reading of this. And so we would see some translations, the Lord searching for a man who's pleasing to him in every way. The Lord has found a man loyal to him. The Lord will search for a man following the Lord's own heart. But also adjectively, notice in the red, it could refer to not just God's character or loyalty, but to God's will or desire. So there's two different interpretations, whether it's adjectival. And this is why the Message has its translation. It's looking at if it's talking about not God's character or his loyalty, but God's will and God's desire. So if heart refers not to his character, but to his desired choice, God's purpose then corresponds with or finds fulfillment in the man. In other words, it's his desire, it's his will to find a man who has a heart that is, well, it's talking about his heart for, well, the basic idea was that God sought for himself a man who was in accord with his own choosing. In other words, the Message, for example, is God is looking out for your replacement right now. In other words, replacing Saul with David. This time he'll do the choosing. That's why the Message has that. It's looking at from not God's character or loyalty, but God's will or desire is being referenced here. But let's take one more look at one more thing, and we'll be closing here. It could be adverbial. Now, an adjective modifies a noun. What does an adverb modify? A verb, right? Okay, so an adverb modifies a verb. And so here it wouldn't be talking about the heart of David, but it would talking about the heart that relative to the verb, which is seeking for himself. In this instance, God's heart or his will serves as a standard by which he seeks a new king. Yahweh, God, seeks for himself, according to his own will, his own desire, a man. In this reading, the verse would say nothing at all about David's character or his heart, because it's referring to God's desire and God's will. It's God's heart, it's desire or will to find a king who's going to be kingly according to God's nature. It focuses on God's act of discretion in selecting David. Out of his will, he seeks in accordance with his image he had or what he expects for a king. There is support in extra biblical text from this, for this perspective. There are texts in which the king's heart gives rise to a selection, God's heart, a pagan God's heart, gives rise to a selection of king. The Hittite New Kingdom Treaty goes back to 1250 BC. That says whatever his son Kuruta prefers, whatever son Kuruta prefers, Kuruta would be the pagan god. Whether the son of his wife or the son of some other woman, whatever the son is choice of the Kuruta. So it refers to the will of the pagan god. Also, the Babylonian Chronicles in 550 to 400 BC talks about the 7th year in the month of such and such, and King Nebuchadnezzar II got his army to march against Hatu. He camped the city around Judah, and on the 2nd day of the month of Adar, he captured the city and seized its king. And then it said, a king of his own choice he appointed in the city. It's his will. It's referring to his nature, or his desire, and the choosing. And then you have texts in which the God's heart give rise to the selection of a pagan god, such as in some king, I can't pronounce this, Enannatun, in the dynasty of Lagash in 2500 BC. He talks about envisaged by the king, by the god Nasha, which is a female god, in her heart to select a king. And then you have several others that support the same view. So here's the point. If the adverbial reading is correct, if it's possible, then this verse tells us nothing about Saul's replacement. But it does tell us something implicitly about David by God's choice. And God, in part, selected David because his life aligned more closely with God's idea of a king that Saul was not. Saul was not the king that God desired him to be. God sought a king that he desired to have in David. That's what the verse is trying to say. If we look at it adverbially, here's some supporting scriptures. In 1 Samuel 15, verse 28, I'll just call them out for time's sake. Samuel tells Saul that God has given the kingdom to a neighbor of yours who's better than you. Okay? In 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, God rejects all of David's brothers, you remember that, from kingship, but declares to David to be the heir of the throne, asserting that the Lord sees not as man sees. We all know this. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks in the heart. It's not David's. It's not talking about our passage, 1 Samuel 13, 14, is adverbially is not referring to David's heart, but God's desire, his heart, to find the king that Saul was not. So he looks upon the heart of David to see if he is the king that he already knows, but to see if he's the king. So God sought the one whose life aligned most closely with this idea of kingship, which is described in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20. We won't go there for time, but you have that recorded if you want to look at it. David was not perfect by any means. Indeed, is far from it, but his inner disposition truly did align more with God's desires. That's what I think it's talking about. God's desires more than Saul's did. Because if you look at the passage, it's in contrast. Let's go to 1 Samuel 13, verse 13. Samuel said to Saul, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept my commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded for you. For now the Lord will have established your kingdom over Israel forever. Verse 14 is our passage. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself Now, the passage we have, tradition has a man after his own heart, referring to a man's heart. But instead, the suggestion is that the Lord has sought for himself, let me get this right here, for himself according to his own will, a man. In other words, one who is going to be the kingly man that Saul was not. And the context shows that this is a contrast to who Saul was not. So there is support for an adverbial reading. And I'm not saying we need to cross out our Bibles, because we have a tradition referring to David's heart. And implicitly, it is talking about David's heart. But if this is functioning adverbially, then it's not really speaking to David's heart. It's speaking to God's will to find one who has a heart, who has a man who can be the king that Saul is not. And I think the context bears up a lot for that. Not saying that that is the answer, but there is some support for that. Even more, David's life pointed to the Son, Jesus, who perfectly matches God's image for a king that Saul did not. You see, I think there's a good reason to think that this is referring to God's desire and will, and not to the heart of David. He's in contrast to speaking to Saul, who is not who he should have been, and it speaks now God desires to find one who, a man who should be the king that Saul is not. I think that's the point there. So I think there's a fascinating little look at it, to take the verse that we started with and end up with it. And I don't know what the right answer is. That would take a lot more effort, and then you choose. I think there is reason to think it's functioning adverbially, but that goes against tradition. Almost all the things look adjectively, most adjectively modifying the man and speaking to the man's, has a character, a heart that's in line with God's character and his loyalty, versus the message, which speaks to the will or desire, the will of God, as the will of the man to have a character, the will of the man aligned with God. I think that's right. I may have it a little backwards. The message is a little odd for me. So any thoughts or questions before I confuse everybody? Make a little bit of sense? Yeah. Okay. Anybody online? You have any thoughts or questions before we close? Well, listen, we have, if you have a thought or question, throw it out there while I'm talking. You can interrupt me. We have dived into verbs, and that is the heart of every sentence, is the verb.
This is the verbs here that we have on the screen. What handouts you have for tonight?
Yeah, one of the handouts I gave, is that, do you have 1% of 13 in there?
7 billion.
The 7 billions, I don't think it has a verse in there. Yeah, no, this has the 7 billion or 7 stems. A billion, billion is plural, so it's 7 billion, binyanim, are stems. So yeah, I had a handout and I sent everyone. So it has the same kind of information. Notice it has the little box down there, 7 binyanim, and the name Pa'al. But notice under qualities, it also calls it the call. That means easy or light or simple. And that is basically what sort of the form that they build from to understand the other verb forms. And the nifal, the PL, the kual, the kufal, the hipal. And so they give you that form, and they give you see the boxes in under form is sort of the group 1, group 2, group 3 position. And they show you the a little small, but they show you the verbal pattern there. On the nifal, they show the new that's added as a prefix and the verbal pattern applied there. That's the same verbal pattern you'll see for all the words in the nifal. Show you how the nifal works. It's as compared to he wrote a simple the pa'al or the call he wrote versus it was written in the nifal. And so you see how that's used throughout. So yeah, that's a little summary that I found and thought was a nice little overview and pretty straightforward. So I hope it helps. So, anything else before we close? Okay, Carl, would you close us in the prayer? Would you mind? Louder.